Headless bus passenger. Late at night, the university campus was eerily quiet and shrouded in darkness. Kala hurried toward the campus bus stop after a long evening of studying. The long, empty street was lit by only a few dim streetlights. There was only one bus left at the stop, its headlights cutting through the cold, misty air. She boarded the bus, her eyes briefly glancing at the driver, a man well into his years, his face lined with deep wrinkles and dark, unreadable eyes. Kala sat in the middle of the bus, trying to relax, but she suddenly sensed something strange. Through the rearview mirror, she realized the driver was staring at her intently. His eyes never left her, as if he was searching for something on her face. After a few minutes, she began to feel something was wrong. The route they were taking was unfamiliar. Instead of heading toward her dormitory, they were drifting into a desolate area where thick darkness swallowed everything. She leaned over, peering out the window, looking around in growing confusion. Kala turned to remind the driver about her destination, but he didn't respond. His eyes were no longer on the mirror, but fixed straight ahead. He pressed on the gas, speeding up, ignoring the narrow, winding roads. Kala's fear surged. She raised her voice.
This isn't the way to my dorm.
But the driver didn't hear or didn't care. His face had gone pale, as though he was terrified of something unseen. Suddenly, the bus swayed, and vague shapes began to materialize outside the windows. At first, they were shadows of people standing by the roadside. Then they became clearer faces with empty eyes, mouths wide open as if screaming in silent agony. They stood there, watching like bloodthirsty specters. Kala curled up, trembling, too afraid to look at those ghostly figures for long. She felt like screaming. After what felt like an eternity, the bus finally slowed down. The familiar sight of the dormitory building appeared ahead, and she felt a wave of relief wash over her. Without wasting time, she grabbed her backpack and hurried off the bus. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, she heard the driver's voice for the first time that night. His voice was low, trembling, and filled with an urgency that sent chills down her spine. The driver's words were brief, but they hit Kala hard.
Wait!
His voice was tense. The driver told her that when he looked in the mirror earlier, he didn't see her head, only a headless body sitting where she was. He had been driving in circles, trying to shake off the spirit he believed had latched onto her. He couldn't hear her when she spoke because, in his eyes, she had already disappeared. He then warned Kala,
When you get to your room, take off your clothes and burn them immediately.
Kala stood still, the weight of the driver's words pressing down on her. Staggering, Kala made her way into the dorm building, her mind still spinning. She fumbled with her key at the door, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Once inside, Kala rushed to her roommate's bed, shaking her awake. Her roommate listened, wide-eyed, as Kala explained what had happened. Without hesitation, Kala frantically began taking off her clothes, her movements hurried and desperate. She gathered them into a pile, staring at them as her mind replayed the driver's warning. With trembling hands, Kala picked up the clothes and went to the bathroom. She struck a match and dropped it onto the pile of fabric. The flames quickly consumed the clothes. But had it really ended? She returned to her room, exhausted, lying down on her bed, but unable to shake off the lingering terror. The room was silent. Only the sound of her and her roommate's breathing filled the space. The next morning, sunlight poured in, as if to dispel the previous night's fear, but unease still clung to her. She stood before the mirror, seeing herself clearly. Her head, her eyes, and her entire body, but her gaze was far from peaceful. She couldn't erase from her mind the image the driver described the moment when he didn't see her head in the mirror. The darkness from the night before still lingered in her thoughts, as if waiting for a moment of weakness to return. She knew her life would never be the same. The haunting memory of being headless and the spirit the driver had tried to divert would forever follow her, reminding her that terrifying things exist right next to us in the most unexpected moments. The crazy man blocked the truck. It was a torrential, rainy day. After finishing a long, exhausting day at work, I drove my old, large truck back home. The windshield wipers battled against the pouring rain, moving in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. The radio crackled faintly, almost drowned out by the sound of rain pounding on the truck's metal body. The road ahead was nearly deserted, a winding path through a remote forest. Tall, ominous trees loomed on both sides, their branches reaching out like twisted, skeletal hands. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white from the cold. My eyes were focused on the road, but my gaze was weary, longing to be home soon. As I rounded a bend in the road, my headlights caught a figure standing in the middle of the road. Finding it strange, I drove a short distance further and then pulled over to the side of the road to rest for a moment. From a distance, there was that figure again. The silhouette was of a man, his hair disheveled and soaked by the rain. He stood motionless, his head slightly tilted to one side, staring straight at me with wide, unblinking eyes. His clothes were tattered and drenched, clinging to his gaunt frame. In his hand, he held something long, thin, and menacing under the headlights. My heart raced as I stared at the man, an instinctual sense of danger warning me. The man did not move, did not blink, just stood there, staring. My breath fogged up the window as I pondered what to do, making his already ominous figure appear even more distorted and terrifying. But before I could act, the man suddenly lunged forward, slamming his hand on the hood of the truck. The force of the impact made me jump out of my seat, my heart pounding. The man's face was now just inches from the windshield. His eyes were wild and bloodshot. I recoiled in horror as I realized the object in his hand was a long, sharp needle, attached to a syringe filled with a murky yellow liquid. The man's mouth curled into a deranged smile, revealing yellowed and cracked teeth. He lifted the needle, tapping it lightly with his finger as if preparing to use it. He fumbled with the door lock, as if deliberately trying to frighten me. The rain outside seemed to grow louder, darkening the scene with a rising sense of dread. The man moved with terrifying speed. He lunged at the side door, yanking it open with astonishing strength. I could barely think, and there was no time to react before the man lunged at me. The syringe was raised, aimed straight at my neck. I struggled, adrenaline surging through my veins as I tried to push the man away. But his grip was like iron, his strength fueled by madness. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Who was this man? What did he want? Why was he doing this? The questions swirled in my head, but there were no answers, only a desperate need to survive. The man giggled, a high-pitched, maniacal sound. The needle inched closer. I twisted and turned, trying to evade it, but the man was relentless. In one final desperate move, I surged with a burst of life. I managed to grab the man's wrist. We wrestled, fighting for control. The man's eyes were wide and wild. His foul breath hit my face in a horrific gust. With gritted teeth, I mustered all my remaining strength and shoved the man back with a powerful force, sending him tumbling backward. The syringe fell to the ground, the needle shattering upon impact, the liquid inside spilling out and mixing with the rain. I slammed the door shut and locked it, breathing heavily, tense with fear. I watched as the man staggered to his feet. He let out a frustrated scream, his voice echoing through the empty forest. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I quickly shifted the truck into gear, and hit the gas, the truck speeding away from the deranged man. Exhausted and shaken from the struggle, I drove in silence, quickly contacting the police about the incident and heading straight to the hospital. The man's wild eyes, his maniacal grin, the syringe filled with that strange liquid, they all haunted my mind. After the police investigated, they finally apprehended him and placed him in custody for psychiatric treatment. It turned out he wasn't just targeting me. He was after others as well, all as part of the twisted pleasure of a deranged mind. Horror story about a truck driver. I started driving trucks at the age of 25 and also encountered many strange cases on the road. I'm pretty sure I've encountered a few UFO while driving at night and occasionally encountered many strange drivers. The story I share with you today is the most horrifying and strange experience I have ever witnessed. In observation, I was 37 years old in 2009. That night was like most nights. I drove and listened to music on the radio, drinking some coffee to keep myself awake. The roads here are very deserted and covered in fog. Gradually, the fog got thicker and thicker, and I started thinking about whether I should pull over for a while or keep driving. I thought so, but in the end, I still chose to continue driving. At this time, there was no one on the country road, so it was probably safe to continue driving. To prevent bad situations from happening, such as an animal or something running across the road, I drove slowly. While I was concentrating on driving, I suddenly smelled something. I thought the smell of sodium carbonate was the worst smell I had ever smelled, but this smell is much worse. This smell quickly filled the inside of my truck. I quickly rolled up the window, but the smell didn't get much better. This horrible smell in my car, and I feel like I could vomit immediately. This smell mixed with the bones creates a disgusting smell. I think nothing can cause a more terrible stench than this. At the same time, I felt an uncomfortable feeling in my throat, that feeling when you want to vomit but have to hold back. Opened the car door and started vomiting. When I was done, I quickly covered my nose because the smell was still in the air. I got in the car and calmed myself down to start driving again. That's when I noticed something crossing the road. The figure was of a man, and he was limping. In addition to his limping gait, I also noticed that the man was wearing an old white button-down shirt and black slacks. I reminisced about the strange and bizarre cases I had encountered. I don't know what to do with that man. Finally, I decided to drive over to ask if he was okay and if he needed me to call for help. Before I drove up to him, I soon realized that 4 more people were coming out from the side of the road. They were all going in the same direction as the first man I saw. They all walked with a strange limp. They all wore old-fashioned peasant clothes. What I found most strange was that they didn't realize there was a big truck going on the other side of the road. I thought to myself, if these people needed help, they would definitely come towards me. However, they all continued to limp across the street, disappearing into the darkness and fog. I emphasized again that I was in the middle of the speedway, meaning there were no houses or anything around. Then another figure stepped out from the darkness and kept crossing the street. However, this figure is much shorter. I got out of my truck, but didn't go to that kid. I just stood there, staring at it. It didn't seem to pay any attention to me. It continued to cross the road. The boy's gait and the clothes he wore were as strange as the previous ones. Just as the boy was about to reach the other end of the street, I shouted,
"Do you need any help?"
The boy stopped and turned his head to face me. My heart sank as soon as. It is a body without a face. I cursed under my breath and stood there in fear. Then, it let out the most terrible scream I've ever heard, limping towards me but at a faster speed than before. I quickly got into the truck and slammed the door. The horrifying screams became more and more frequent, louder, and more people came out from the darkness. I quickly drove away from the boy, accelerating to get out of this place as soon as possible. During the escape, those people were approaching, all of them faceless. When I drove to a residential area, I stopped at a gas station. I just sat there in my truck because my mind and heart were still shaking. My mind was blank. This experience has opened up so many things to me. I understand that this world is really strange, and there will always exist things that we never think about. The story I want to tell next is, it was early June 2017. I was taking a road trip with my 9-year-old son Tony to West Virginia to visit family. It was a long, stressful drive. My car didn't have working AC at the time, and it was an incredibly hot day, so we were a bit stressed out. By the 6-hour mark, we had left later in the day, so we were still on the road by dark. I think it was around 9 o'clock p.m. when we were still on the road, and Tom started complaining that he needed to use the bathroom. There was already tension in the car before this, but his constant complaining brought about a slight argument between the two of us. At last, I saw a blue rest area sign zoom past us on the interstate, so I veered off into the rest area. It had a small building with 2 bathrooms, a couple of vending machines, and a few benches. That was it. There were no other cars parked nearby, besides some big white pickup truck. As I pulled up next to the building, Tom got out in a hurry and ran to the bathroom. I left the car on because I knew he'd be back soon. Like I said, I don't want to get into personal stuff like why we had a bit of an argument, but it seemed we were at that stage where we weren't exchanging words anymore. I figured the rest of the ride would be silent. About a minute later, the back door opened. I wanted to say something to Tom, but I didn't know what to say, so I just stayed quiet and drove off. I noticed that the white pickup truck parked nearby was leaving as well. I veered back onto the interstate and into the left lane, and the pickup truck did the same. I stepped on it a little, and so did he. He started flashing his lights, so I switched to the right lane thinking he was nothing but an aggressive driver. But as soon as I switched to the right, so did he. He was still flashing his lights. I pulled into the right lane and started to slow down. He sped up, still in the middle lane, and when he caught up to me, he slowed down and lowered his window. I did the same.
Hey!
And he started yelling something to me, pointing at my car. He looked like a creepy, sketchy dude at first glance. I couldn't hear a word he was saying, so he pointed for me to pull over to the side. I told Tom to keep calm. In my head, I was saying if this guy tried to do anything funny, I would floor it. The pickup pulled up behind me on the grass, and the guy came out of his truck running to my car. I put the car back in drive as my heart was racing, ready to drive, but then he screamed, "Wait!" He got to my window and said,
That's not your kid, and pointed to the back seat.
He said, "That's not your kid that got in your car." Suddenly, the back right side door opens, and I turned to see someone getting out of my car, not my son Tom. I got out from the car, screaming at the tall person who seemed to be a fully grown man, but they had already disappeared into the woods. I looked at the driver of the pickup and thanked him as I suddenly panicked, thinking about what could have happened to Tom. I got back in my car, crossed the grass between the interstate, and drove back to the rest area. The guy in the pickup followed me. We got back there in like 30 seconds to find Tom waiting outside the rest area bathroom. He got back in the car, all confused. I explained everything to him, almost out of breath, as did the pickup driver. I thanked the guy one more time before he drove back to the spot he was sitting in before. Tom was so intrigued about what just happened, and I was so disturbed that we were back on good terms again. We chatted the whole rest of the way and told family about it as soon as we arrived. I never even got to see what the person who got in my car looked like. Honestly, Maybe I should be happy I never turned around to look at them because I don't know what they would have done. Take the wrong Uber driver. It was late November, and we had a small party. I stumbled out of the bar into the freezing cold air. I stood on the sidewalk, the world around me spinning slightly, my mind foggy from the alcohol. My friends stayed behind, eager to celebrate a little longer, but I had a flight to catch the next morning. I needed to pack. I needed to sleep, so I booked an Uber to take me home. I opened the app, and luckily, a driver accepted almost instantly. The app showed it would arrive in 4 minutes. Then, a car pulled up. The car's headlights flashed at me. From a distance, I thought I saw someone wave at me from the window. I was tired, and maybe my app was just glitching. The driver must have arrived early, that's all. Without thinking much, I stumbled into the car. Inside, the car smelled faintly of old cigarettes, and the seat creaked beneath me. I glanced at the driver in the front seat. He didn't look back at me, didn't say a word. He didn't even confirm my name. I just wanted to get home. I muttered my address and leaned back in the seat. It was then that I noticed the GPS on his dashboard was turned off. I was startled. Why hadn't he entered my address into his GPS? Everyone uses GPS for Uber, even drivers familiar with the area. I watched him drive, hoping he just knew the route well. The car sped down the street, but something felt off. This wasn't the way to my dorm. I nervously told him.
I think you're going the wrong way. My school is in the opposite direction.
For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, he glanced in the rearview mirror and nodded, but he didn't turn the car around. He just kept driving. I started to panic. Where was he taking me? The car stopped in front of a rundown office building. The street was deserted. Why had he stopped here? He didn't say a word. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the car. Slamming the door shut, my mind raced. My hands trembled as I slowly pulled out my phone. My heart sank when I saw the missed calls from my actual Uber driver. I'd gotten into the wrong car. This wasn't my Uber. I was in danger. I needed to get out now. I quickly sent my location to a friend via text. If I called the police, he might hear me. But then I heard a slow, low chuckle. I looked up through the window, and there he was, smirking at me, staring. He circled the car. My hand moved toward the door, pressing down the lock. He hadn't noticed. I frantically moved from door to door, locking each one in a frenzy. The faint noise alerted him. His smile vanished. His eyes narrowed in anger. He stepped closer to the driver's door, his hand reaching for the handle. When it didn't open, he angrily pulled at it, yelling, "Open the door!" I knew I only had a few seconds left. Desperate, not waiting any longer, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, hoping they could get there faster. I didn't get a chance to speak. The sound of glass shattering stopped me, and I screamed as I saw him punch the window with his bare hand, glass flying everywhere. His arm pushed through the broken window. I dropped my phone, desperately trying to get away from him, clutching the door handle on the other side, frantically unlocking it to escape before he could grab me. I ran as fast as I could since he was injured and stuck with his hand in the broken window. I couldn't stop. I stumbled but kept running, my body filled with overwhelming terror. The night was pitch black, with the only light coming from the distant glow of the city. The abandoned lot stretched endlessly, nowhere to hide. But I kept running, praying that somehow I would survive. I spotted a small store up ahead, its neon open sign flickering weakly in the distance. My legs burned, but I didn't dare look back, not until I reached the store. I burst through the door, gasping for breath, my entire body shaking with fear. The store clerk stared at me, wide-eyed in surprise. But I was thankful I had escaped him. The police arrived minutes later. 2 patrol cars stopped in front of the office building where the car had been parked. But when they got there, the car and the man were gone. Only shattered, blood-stained glass remained. The police reassured me that they would search for him. It was a hard lesson learned that I must always be more careful when going out alone, especially when I'm not fully alert. Late night passenger. When I was younger, chasing money at all hours of the night seemed necessary. I picked up a side job as an Uber driver. The job wasn't glamorous, but driving around the big city was something I enjoyed. Every day after 5 p.m., I'd grab a quick bite and begin my Uber shifts. Most nights ended around 2 a.m. This story took place on one of those long nights, about 6 months after working 2 jobs simultaneously. There was a hospital downtown with a large parking lot. It became my regular spot to take short naps while waiting for rides. It was quiet, away from the city noise. That night, after hours of driving, I went there to rest. I didn't plan on sleeping long, just a 15-minute nap. When I woke up, I couldn't remember where I was for a few minutes. I glanced at the dashboard, and only 15 minutes had passed. My music playlist was still playing, soft and mellow. I checked my phone, hoping I hadn't missed any ride requests. That's when I saw it. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of something that made my heart stop. A man was suddenly sitting in the back seat. He was right behind me, just staring. Then he smiled, a creepy, unsettling grin. I turned to face him, and sure enough, he was there. He looked disheveled, his clothes torn and dirty, and he only wore one shoe. His face was grimy, and he seemed exhausted, like he had been on the streets for a while. Something wasn't right with him. I didn't know how long he had been there, how he got in, or what he wanted. I glanced at his hand, and there it was, an open phone displaying the Uber app. My mind started racing. Maybe he had wandered out of the hospital, saw my car running, and thought it was his ride. I tried to stay calm. "Hey, are you waiting for a ride?" He didn't respond right away. His eyes darted from the roof of the car to the floor, avoiding my gaze. I pointed to his phone, hoping he understood. I asked again, "Do you need a ride?" He nodded. The gesture was slow, cautious, and uneasy. I forced a smile and told him I'd take him where he needed to go. I tried to act normal, to ease the tension in the car. But deep down, something about this man wasn't right. I left the hospital parking lot, following his vague directions to an old, closed-down music venue downtown. Then it hit me. I hadn't accepted a ride request on the Uber app. This guy wasn't my passenger. I glanced at the rear-view mirror again. His phone didn't show any ride request. He wasn't connected to me at all. I spoke, trying to keep my voice calm. "I just realized this ride hasn't been registered. Can you find me on the app quickly?" That's when his entire demeanor changed. He scoffed, looking out the window, then turned to me with a cold expression, saying he wasn't going to pay for the ride. I nervously chuckled, hoping it was a joke, but he remained silent. The atmosphere in the car grew tense. I glanced at him again and noticed a hospital discharge bracelet on his wrist and a dirty backpack beside him. I was trapped in the car with a homeless drifter who must have snuck in while I was asleep. I needed to get him out. I told him I wasn't giving him a free ride across town, and that he was lucky I hadn't called the police. But before I could grab my phone, he lunged and wrapped his hands around my neck. His hands were rough, calloused. I struggled trying to pry his fingers off, but he was too strong. A stench emanated from him. I could barely breathe. Instinct kicked in, and I slammed my foot on the brake. The sudden stop sent him flying forward, loosening his grip just enough for me to break free. I swerved toward the curb. He was dazed. I shifted the car into park, dialed 911, and honked the horn. He groaned, recovering from the impact, and started coming at me again. But this time, I wasn't powerless. I screamed into the phone, describing everything as fast as I could. Then, as if he realized the game was over, he grabbed his backpack and bolted out of the car, vanishing into the night. A few blocks away, the police caught up to him. I watched as they cuffed him. Later, I found out he had escaped from the hospital after being admitted for an overdose. He wasn't just a drifter, he was dangerous, and I had escaped something terrible. As the night came to a close, the only thought in my mind was, I'll never forget to lock my car doors again. Horror story about the rocking chair. My name is Jonathan, and there was a time when I frequently experienced severe sleep disorders. I often woke up in a vegetative state. Every time I lay down to sleep, nightmares would come. It started when I woke up at night feeling trapped in my body. I could see, feel, and hear everything around me, but I couldn't act. Gradually, it became more complex. One night, I woke up and found myself standing near the bed, looking at myself. I can't describe how terrified I was. I decided to see a psychologist. Drive. Beman gave me sedatives and said that over time, it would go away. And I would have to learn how to improve my sleep. I followed his instructions, and within a month, I was quite good. But suddenly, things got worse. Since I had just moved in, I didn't have much furniture. Besides the sofa, there was a TV set, a table lamp, and a rocking chair. It was in the apartment before I moved in. I kept it as an extra seat for myself. One night, I fell asleep on the living room sofa. I woke up feeling trapped, but this time, I saw someone sitting in the rocking chair, rocking back and forth. The feeling of suffocation, like being pinned down, was overwhelming me. The scariest part was knowing. I was awake, but also knowing I was seeing something that didn't exist. I saw a woman, around 70 years old, and there was no one else in the apartment but me. She didn't face me or make any sound, just rocking back and forth. It must have been my imagination because as soon as I snapped out of that state, the woman disappeared. I went to see my psychologist and talked about it, and he also said it was just a hallucination. I learned to meditate before going to bed because it would help my sleep, and I did it for a few weeks. I felt reassured that I had stopped experiencing these things until one night. That day, I was comfortable and relaxed for the first time in a long time with my friend. My friend Ren stayed over that night. Around 3 a.m., I heard heavy breathing from a very close distance. As soon as I opened my eyes, I saw a horrifying face leaning towards me, staring straight into my eyes. Her thin white hair was all over me. It was the woman rocking in the chair. I tried to call out, but my voice was choked. My lips couldn't move. I let out a weak groan that sounded like the moan of a zombie. I wanted to scream. I thought I was dead. My fear also subsided. I gradually became aware of my breathing. The woman then said to me, go away, run away. I gasped, unable to breathe from the shock. She stood up and began to circle around me hungrily. Her jaw started to elongate into a large gaping mouth, then disappeared into the darkness. I jumped up and screamed, startling Ren, who had no idea what was wrong with me. Ren woke up in shock.
What the hell, man? What's going on?
I fainted before I could say anything. Everything felt so real, but no one believed me. The doctors thought I had a panic attack in my sleep due to intoxication. I was kept under special care for a week. After hearing her words, I moved to a new place, but before leaving, I shared my story. I also asked the landlord about the history of the rocking chair. He said that many years ago, this apartment was a healthcare unit for people with mental disorders. She just liked to be alone and rocked the chair day after day. She hated noise and disturbance and passed away right in that chair. After that, I left because of her warnings. That was probably the last time I saw her. Trained to hell. Rai, he had once been a professional thief. No matter where he was, he could carry out his actions smoothly. That day, the location was the subway, and it was also where he would pay a heavy price for his sins. While fleeing from pursuit, Rai boarded a subway train that looked quite old, carrying the scent of damp concrete, rust, and something faintly metallic, almost like the smell of blood. The subway car was nearly empty, except for a few scattered passengers in various cars. Most of them seemed lost in their own worlds. One was dozing off, another absorbed in their phone. But then, at the far end of the car, there was an older man who looked quite terrifying. He wore a long, dark coat, his face obscured by shadows, but his eyes were cold and piercing, chillingly sharp. Rai tried to shake off the discomfort, shifting in his seat, looking elsewhere. But the feeling of always being watched made him very alert. The subway suddenly jolted, the lights flickering more violently before dimming to a weak, pale yellow. The train began to slow down, the sound of the brakes screeching like a high-pitched wail echoing through the thief's skull. He glanced around, noticing that the other passengers had disappeared, leaving only him and the mysterious man at the end of the car. He tried to stand up, move toward the exit, but his legs were stiff. The man in the dark coat began to stand up, moving toward him with slow, deliberate steps, his eyes never leaving the thief. The subway train came to a complete stop. The doors remained closed. The thief was trapped. The man approached the thief, raising one hand with fingers unusually long and thin, and waved it slowly in front of the thief's face. The thief's eyes glazed over, his mind succumbing to the invisible power of hypnosis. His body went limp, collapsing into the seat as he was pulled into a vision, deeper and deeper, until the subway car completely vanished. Rai found himself standing in a nightmarish version of a subway station. The walls were cracked and oozing a thick black substance, the lights flickering. The tracks were covered in a dense, glowing red fog that seemed to rise from the very depths of the earth, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The thief staggered forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he looked around, trying to find a way out. But the exits were blocked, sealed shut by heavy iron gates covered in chains and padlocks that had mysteriously appeared. A moment later, he suddenly saw a reflection in the glass, a reflection of himself, but with his coat tattered and scorched, his face pale and gaunt, with hollow, sunken eyes. His lips twisted into a grotesque, terrifying smile. Scenes of his past crimes played out before him, distorted and twisted into horrific images of suffering and despair. In one scene, he watched himself pickpocketing a man on the subway, but this time, the man turned to him, his face melting away to reveal a skull with eyes burning with fire. The skeletal figure grabbed the thief's wrist, pulling him into the darkness where the sound of screams echoed. Next, another vision unfolded. Rye broke into an apartment, and suddenly, the floor beneath him collapsed. He fell into a pit filled with writhing hands, clawing at his flesh as they dragged him down, as if pulling him into hell. The images kept coming, each more horrifying than the last. Each vision was a punishment for the sins he had committed. He saw himself as one of the damned, trapped forever on this hellish train, riding the tracks of torment for all eternity. Inside the train, the thief was surrounded by the ghosts of his past victims. Their eyes burned with the fire of hatred. In his own eyes, the furnace roared with life, the flames growing hotter until they consumed everything. The thief was left in total darkness. The thief snapped back to reality, gasping for breath, his body drenched in sweat. He was back in the subway car. The man in the dark coat was gone, leaving only the sound of the train clattering on the tracks. Shaking, the thief staggered to his feet and exited the train. As he stepped onto the platform, he glanced back at the subway car. The train pulled away, the sound of its departure echoing through the empty station. The thief stood alone, the weight of his sins pressing down on him. Now he knew that there was no escaping the consequences, the punishment for his actions. Since that day, he has lived in darkness, plagued by agonizing headaches that feel like torture. He must live in fear, haunted by what he had seen and experienced. Perhaps this is just one of the punishments he has to endure. Stalker at the bus stop. A quiet and snowy Sunday evening. I was sitting at the bus stop, looking at my phone, and realized I had missed my bus. I started to shiver as the weather grew colder. Time passed slowly. I pulled out my phone again, put on my earphones, and selected a song to forget the uncomfortable cold. I looked around, realizing I was completely alone. No cars, no pedestrians, just an endless, empty street. Nearly an hour went by, and the bus was still nowhere in sight. I checked my phone again. The screen showed no updates on the bus's arrival, and the battery was dangerously low. A while later, I sensed some movement. A man wrapped in several layers of thick clothing, his face obscured by a knitted hood. The man walked with a strange, almost unsteady gait, as if he wasn't sure where he was going. I froze but tried to focus on my phone, not wanting to draw attention. The man approached the bus stop and sat at the opposite end of the bench. My discomfort grew. I glanced at the man, noticing part of his face exposed under the hood, a gaunt, pale face with eyes that seemed unfocused, distant. The man was muttering something to himself, his words slurred and incoherent. I shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something was off about this person. He moved closer, almost imperceptibly at first, but with each subtle shift, he inched toward me. My unease turned into panic as the man continued to slide closer, his gaze fixed on me in a strange, unsettling way. I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, I felt the man's presence right next to me. The tension was unbearable. I quickly stood up, grabbed my bag, and started walking away from the bus stop. The man, still sitting there, tilted his head to the side, his eyes never leaving me as I walked away. I quickly walked away. I reached the next bus stop and finally felt somewhat relieved. I began to sit down slowly, letting my guard down a little as I waited for the bus. I closed my eyes for a moment, exhausted The quiet of the falling snow was almost peaceful. Suddenly, a loud and rapid knock shattered the silence. My eyes shot open, my heart racing, and I slowly turned around to see the man from the previous bus stop, standing on the other side of the glass, his face pressed against it, grinning maniacally. His eyes were wide, staring straight at me without blinking. He kept knocking on the glass, his breath fogging up the surface. Panic flooded my body. I quickly stood up and backed away from the glass. The man began moving, circling around, his gait more erratic than before. His footsteps grew closer. I backed away, yelling at the man to stay away. However, the man was undeterred. He raised his hand, reaching out as if to do something to me. Luckily, I reacted just in time, darting off the sidewalk as the man lunged toward me. In a strange, inexplicable way, he slipped forward, his face slamming hard into the cold, icy pavement. The sound was horrifying. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was so bizarre. I watched in horror as blood began to pool around the man's face, staining the snow with a deep red. My mind raced as I tried to process what had just occurred. I crouched down, attempting to get a response from him, but there was none. I sat down on the curb, my hands trembling as I pulled out my phone and called for help. The snow continued to fall, turning this bus stop into a place of horror and dread for me. The flashing lights of the ambulance and police car pierced through the night. Paramedics rushed to the man's side, but it was clear that something was very wrong with him. As the paramedics searched the man's belongings, they found a photograph in his wallet, a picture of the man with a boy who looked eerily similar to me. The police explained that the man had been on prescription drugs after losing his son, and his mental state had deteriorated ever since. I realized, with disbelief, that the man may have mistaken me for his lost son. A few days later, I took my driving test. As I drove, I glanced down the road where the bus stop was in the distance, the events of that night still haunting me deeply. I couldn't shake the sorrow of the man's grief and the terrifying experience that had unfolded. Horror Story Haunted Tracks. The legend of the haunted tracks had always been a topic of eerie fascination in our small town. The story went that, decades ago, a tragic train accident had occurred on the old, abandoned railway line just outside town. Many lives were lost that fateful night, and it was said that the spirits of the victims still lingered, haunting the area. As a skeptic, I never believed in ghosts or haunted places, but that changed one cold winter night. I was driving back home after visiting a friend when a heavy snowstorm hit, making the roads nearly impassable. I decided to take a shortcut through the old railway crossing, hoping to save some time. The wind howled, and snow fell in thick, blinding sheets as I navigated the narrow, winding road. The visibility was almost zero, and I had to slow down to a crawl. As I approached the old crossing, my car suddenly stalled. I tried to restart it, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Frustrated, I got out to check under the hood, the biting cold stinging my face and hands. As I fumbled with the engine, I heard a faint, distant whistle. I froze, remembering the tales of the haunted tracks. The whistle grew louder, and I saw a light piercing through the snowstorm, heading straight toward me. Panic set in as I realized it was an old steam train. barreling down the tracks at an alarming speed. I abandoned my car and tried to run, but the snow was too deep and I stumbled. As the train approached, I could see it more clearly. A rusted, ancient locomotive, its windows shattered, and the metal twisted and scorched. I braced myself for the impact, but it never came. Instead, the train passed right through me, sending a bone-chilling cold through my body. I turned to see it continue down the tracks, disappearing into the storm. Shaking, I returned to my car and tried the engine again. This time, it roared to life, and I wasted no time getting back on the road, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally reached home, I was too shaken to sleep. The next day, I told my friend Mark about the experience. Mark, a local history buff, was intrigued and suggested we investigate the site together. Armed with flashlights and a camera, we headed to the old railway crossing that evening. The storm had passed, leaving a calm, clear night. The tracks looked abandoned, covered in snow and rusted with age. As we walked along the line, Mark recounted the details of the accident. A collision between two trains due to a signaling error, killing dozens of passengers. Suddenly, we heard it again, the distant whistle. The air grew colder, and a light appeared down the tracks. We watched in disbelief as the same ghostly train emerged from the darkness, moving silently toward us. Mark, braver than I, stepped forward with his camera, snapping pictures. The train passed through us again, leaving us both shivering and breathless. When we reviewed the photos, we were stunned. In each shot, ghostly figures were visible. Faces twisted in pain and fear, hands pressed against the windows as if pleading for help. We had captured the spirits of the victims, forever trapped on their final, tragic journey. The haunted tracks were no longer just a legend. They were a grim reminder of the lives lost and the restless souls that still wandered, seeking peace. I never took that shortcut again, and the memory of that night remained etched in my mind, a chilling testament to the power of the supernatural. The Yin and Yang Train. The Midnight Express was a train shrouded in mystery and fear. It was said to appear only once a year, on a stormy night, traveling through the remote countryside. Legend had it that those who boarded the train never returned. As a journalist for a local newspaper, I had always been skeptical of such tales, but I couldn't resist the lure of a good story. This year, I decided to investigate. It was a dark and stormy night, fitting for the task at hand. I drove to the old, abandoned train station where the Midnight Express was rumored to appear. The station was in disrepair, with weeds growing through the cracks in the platform and broken windows staring like empty eyes. The air was thick with anticipation and the distant rumble of thunder. I set up my camera and waited, the rain pouring down relentlessly. Just as I was beginning to doubt the legend, a distant whistle pierced the night. My heart raced as I saw the faint glow of the train's headlight approaching. The Midnight Express emerged from the darkness, an old steam engine with an eerie, almost spectral appearance. The train slowed to a halt, its doors creaking open. Despite my fear, I boarded the train, determined to uncover the truth. The interior was surprisingly well preserved, with plush seats and dim, flickering lights. The air inside was cold, and an unsettling silence hung over everything. I took a seat and prepared my notebook and camera, ready to document whatever I encountered. As the train began to move, I noticed that I was not alone. A few other passengers were scattered throughout the train, all of them staring straight ahead, their faces devoid of emotion. I tried to strike up a conversation with the man sitting across from me, but he remained silent, his eyes empty and hollow. A shiver ran down my spine. The train moved through the night, the storm raging outside. I decided to explore the other cars, hoping to find someone willing to talk. As I walked through the train, I noticed the passengers all had the same vacant expressions. They seemed more like mannequins than living people. My unease grew with each step. In the last car, I found a conductor. He was an old man with a weathered face and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through me.
Can I help you?
He asked, his voice gravelly and cold. I told him I was a journalist investigating the Midnight Express and asked about the passengers.
They are souls trapped between this world and the next. This train is their purgatory, a place where they must confront their past sins before moving on.
I felt a chill as I realized the gravity of his words. Why am I here? I asked. The conductor's eyes darkened.
You sought the truth, and now you are part of it. You must face your own demons before you can leave.
Panic set in as I tried to leave the car, but the door wouldn't budge. The train began to feel like a prison, the walls closing in on me. I ran back to my seat, hoping to find some way out. The passengers' faces seemed to contort into grotesque masks, their eyes following my every move. Desperate, I looked out the window, but the landscape had changed. Instead of the familiar countryside, I saw scenes from my own life, moments of regret, guilt, and pain. The train was forcing me to confront my own past. As the storm outside intensified, so did my memories. I realized I had spent my life running from my mistakes, never facing the consequences of my actions. The train slowed to a stop, and the conductor appeared again.
It's time,
he said. With a deep breath, I stepped off the train and into the unknown, ready to confront my past and seek redemption. The Midnight Express disappeared into the night, leaving me alone on the platform, but no longer afraid. I had found my story, and it was one that I would carry with me forever. Horror Story Nightwalkers. I used to work at a small hotel on the edge of town. The hotel was quite peaceful, nestled between dense woods and a long, deserted road. After a hurricane swept through the town, business slowed down significantly. I worked the night shift, from 6 o'clock p.m. to 2 o'clock a.m., often without seeing anyone for hours. The only sound in the empty lobby was the ticking of the old clock on the wall. One night, I was sitting in the break room, sipping warm coffee and watching the security monitors when I heard a deep voice call out from the lobby. I got up and went to the front desk. There was a man standing on the other side of the glass partition. He was tall, with wild hair and a strange, jittery energy about him. He asked for some towels, so I handed them to him through the opening under the glass. He grabbed them with such force that it made me flinch, and then he left without saying another word. Curious, I watched him on the security monitor as he walked down the hallway, rubbing the towels against his face and neck. It was bizarre, but I shrugged it off and returned to the break room. About 10 minutes later, I heard his voice again. This time, he was back at the front desk, banging on the glass. "My key card isn't working," he shouted. I asked for his room number, but he responded strangely, saying something like 2C Pui, which didn't match our room numbering system. When I told him that, his demeanor changed. He leaned close to the glass, his eyes wide and wild. "I'm going to kill you," he said with a cold smile. I froze as he repeated it, louder each time, until he was nearly screaming. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, shouting at him that the police were on their way. He stared at me with that twisted smile, mocking me as I spoke to the dispatcher. Finally, he left the hotel, disappearing into the night. I was shaken but relieved that he was gone. I decided to stay in the lobby for the rest of my shift. When my relief arrived at 2:00 a.m., I hurried outside, eager to get home. The cold night air bit at my skin as I walked through the empty parking lot. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, like someone walking on tiptoes. I turned around, and there he was, hiding behind a car. His eyes followed me from the shadows, and he whispered, "I'm going to kill you." Panic surged through me. I looked around, trying to decide what to do. My only chance was to run to the nearest house with a light on. I sprinted to the door and pounded on it, screaming for help. Just as he grabbed me from behind, the door flew open, and the homeowner shouted, scaring him off. I collapsed in relief as the homeowner called the police. The police arrived, but he had already disappeared. I identified him on the security footage, but they never caught him. To this day, I still wonder if he's out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for another chance. Strange clown in the parking lot. It was a chilly October evening in 2016, just a few weeks before Halloween. My friends, Jake and Sarah, and I decided to catch a late-night movie at the local theater. After the movie, which ended around midnight, we lingered in the parking lot, chatting and enjoying the crisp autumn air. The parking lot was mostly empty, illuminated by a few dim streetlights, creating long shadows that danced eerily around us. As we laughed about the horror movie we had just seen, Jake suddenly fell silent, staring behind us. We turned to see a clown standing by an old, beat-up car at the edge of the parking lot. He was dressed in a dirty, oversized clown suit with a red wig and smeared white face paint. Unlike the clowns at birthday parties, this one had a sinister air about him, his smile too wide and his eyes too dark. At first, we thought it was a prank. After all, clown sightings had become a bizarre trend that year. But as he started walking towards us, the playful notion quickly vanished. His movements were slow and deliberate, and in his gloved hand, he held a balloon that bobbed menacingly with each step. Nervously, we decided to head to Jake's car, which was parked a short distance away. We tried to act casual, but our pace quickened with each step. The clown followed, maintaining a steady, unnerving pace. My heart pounded as we reached the car and scrambled inside. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. Just as we opened and locked the doors, the clown reached the car. He leaned against the driver's side window, his face inches away from Jake's. He pressed the balloon against the glass and slowly dragged his finger down the window, leaving a streak in the condensation. We could see his eyes clearly now, cold and calculating. He tapped on the glass, the sound echoing in the silent parking lot. We were frozen with fear, unsure of what to do next. The clown then moved to the front of the car, standing directly in the headlights. He reached into his oversized pocket and pulled out a long, jagged knife. The sight of the blade sent a fresh wave of panic through us. Jake finally snapped out of his shock and started the car. The engine roared to life, and the clown took a step back, still smiling that unsettling smile. We peeled out of the parking lot, tires screeching, and didn't stop until we were miles away, parked in front of a 24-hour diner. We sat in the car, catching our breath and trying to make sense of what had just happened. We debated calling the police, but without any real harm done, we doubted they'd take us seriously. In the end, we decided to keep the story to ourselves, not wanting to relive the terrifying encounter. To this day, the image of that clown and his menacing smile haunts us. We often wonder what his intentions were and shudder at the thought of what might have happened if we hadn't reached the car in time. The experience left a lasting impression, a chilling reminder that sometimes the scariest encounters are the ones that seem to step straight out of a nightmare. We met a crazy clown in the woods. In the summer of 2016, amid bizarre clown sightings across the USA, I stayed at our friend Milo's house, which bordered a dense forest. After a day of movies and snacks, we felt restless and decided to take a late-night walk. Armed with flashlights, we ventured into the forest at 2 a.m., our conversation mingling with the sounds of the night. By 2:45 a.m., we reached a clearing with an old, creaky playground until Milo pointed towards the old restroom building. There, partially illuminated by our flashlights, stood a man in a tattered blood red clown suit. Unlike the playful clowns from childhood, this one was menacing. His face was pale, with smudged makeup and a wide, eerie grin. His hair was a tangled mess of red and black. Paralyzed with fear, we watched as the clown stared at us, his head tilted to one side. Then, he started walking towards us, slow but deliberate. Panic surged through us, and we instinctively backed away, trying to decide whether to flee or confront the figure. Suddenly, the clown broke into a sprint.
Help me!
That was all the motivation we needed. We turned and ran as fast as we could back towards Milo's house, the forest path a blur beneath our feet. After what felt like an eternity, we burst out of the forest and onto the road in front of Milo's house. We glanced back and saw the clown standing at the forest's edge, partially illuminated by the streetlight. He had stopped running but was still watching us, his sinister grin visible even from a distance. In his hand, he held a big rusty axe. We didn't wait to see what he would do next. We bolted into Milo's house, slamming the door shut behind us. Milo's parents were out of town, so it was just the two of us, alone and terrified. We gathered in the living room, each of us trying to catch our breath and process what had just happened. Milo turned on the front door camera, and we watched the screen in tense silence. The clown appeared at the edge of the frame, walking slowly down the street towards the house. He stopped in front of the gate, looking around as if searching for something. My heart sank as he approached the front door, his gaze fixed on the camera. He leaned in close, his face filling the screen, and made a series of grotesque, mocking gestures. He waved the knife slowly before stepping back and disappearing down the street. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, too scared to sleep. The image of the clown's twisted grin and the knife haunted our thoughts. We didn't tell anyone about the encounter, fearing disbelief or ridicule. To this day, the memory of that night lingers, a chilling reminder of how a seemingly innocent adventure can turn into a nightmare. We often wonder what might have happened If we hadn't run back to Milo's house, and the unsettling question of who or what the clown continues to haunt us. Night shift at the morgue. I worked as a security guard at a local hospital in the morgue area. The place often experienced break-ins by a few addicts trying to experiment with some strange chemicals stored in the lab, and eventually it became their final resting place. Everything started like a normal night shift. Hygiene plays a crucial role in the hospital. To keep the place more sanitary, they recently installed automatic sliding doors that open when someone passes by, eliminating the need to touch any door handles. Every night at exactly 3:00 a.m., the door would open for a few seconds and then close again. I believe the door was programmed with some kind of time-based trigger. But when I contacted the door installation company, they told me that was impossible since the door was designed to open only when the sensor was activated or manually operated. So, this continued without explanation for a long time and became a routine for everyone watching the door open and close on the monitor every night. Tonight, I was on shift alone because my colleague was sick, and there wasn't enough time to find a temporary replacement on such short notice. I was no stranger to danger and didn't worry about working alone at night. The security monitors showed only 2 cameras, one facing the control room and another at the far end of the hallway looking toward the morgue entrance. When the clock struck 3:00 a.m., I did what every night guard on duty would do. I started watching the screen. As usual, the door moved, but honestly, I still got chills sometimes from the sudden rush of cold air every time the door opened. Suddenly, the door remained open. I thought it was a screen glitch, but the lights on the door were still flashing. I waited a few minutes, but I soon realized I had to go down the hallway because the morgue door was strictly prohibited from being left open. As I walked down the hallway, the cold air blew against me, and I thought it would be even colder when I reached the morgue. I had hoped that the door might have closed by the time I got there, but just as I saw on the monitor, the door was indeed still open, and the camera was functioning normally. I tried waving my hand in front of the sensor, but it was useless. The door didn't budge. I reluctantly considered my next option, which was to check the sensors from the inside. As I turned around to look down the hallway, the door finally closed. I felt my hair stand on end as a strange quietness settled in a sensation like someone was standing right behind me. Out of curiosity, I went back to the monitor. I decided to rewind the security footage to the moment I approached the door to see if I could spot anything unusual. And what I saw was something I shouldn't have witnessed. There was a girl standing in front of the door behind me. I couldn't clearly see her face because of her long black hair and the white dress she was wearing. She just stood there smiling, staring at me with one eye. To this day, I still can't explain it, as I had just been there and hadn't seen anyone. It wasn't until I checked the other camera that faced the entrance to the control room that I truly shuddered, and I still have nightmares about it to this day. Due to a mysterious power surge, most of the data on the drive was completely corrupted. I stared at the blank screen, my mind reeling. The events of that night played over and over in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still in the room, watching from the shadows. Every night, as I try to sleep, when the clock strikes 3:00 a.m., I can still feel the chill in the air, the weight of invisible eyes on my back, and the quiet whisper of the girl who was there. The old classroom was sealed off. It was my senior year of high school when the rumors about room 217 started circulating. Room 217 was an old, unused classroom tucked away at the end of the third-floor hallway, sealed off for as long as anyone could remember. The door was always locked, the windows covered in thick layers of dust. Students whispered about it in hushed tones, claiming it was haunted, though no one seemed to know why. One rainy afternoon, after staying late for an after-school project, my curiosity got the best of me. My friends had all gone home, and the school was eerily quiet. As I packed up my things, I realized I had left my notebook in the library. On my way back to get it, I wandered down the third-floor hallway, my footsteps echoing off the walls. The scene was so empty and scary. When I reached the end of the hall, there it was, room 217. The door looked like it hadn't been touched in years, the wood cracked and the brass handle tarnished. But to my surprise, as I approached, I heard a faint noise coming from inside, indistinct whispers. I stopped dead in my tracks, straining to hear more clearly. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was whispering behind that door. My pulse quickened as I stood there, unsure whether to leave or investigate. Against my better judgment, I reached for the doorknob, fully expecting it to be locked. It wasn't. The lock was completely rusted and no longer worked. The door creaked open with a low groan, revealing the dark, abandoned classroom inside. Desks were scattered haphazardly, chairs overturned, as if the room had been left in a hurry. Dust particles floated in the pale light that filtered through the dirty windows, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. As I stepped inside, the whispering grew louder. It seemed to come from every corner of the room, though I couldn't make out any specific words. I scanned the room, but there was no one there. My heart raced, my hands trembling as I reached for the nearest desk, half expecting something to leap out at me. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. I was locked in. The whispering grew frantic, almost angry, as if the unseen voices were arguing among themselves. My chest tightened with panic, and I backed away toward the windows, desperate to find a way out. But the windows wouldn't budge, sealed shut by years of grime and rust. Then I saw it. On the far side of the room, scrawled in jagged, uneven handwriting on the chalkboard, was a message: "Get out." The air grew colder, and the whispers intensified. They were louder now, furious, as if urging me to leave. But the door remained locked. My head spun, the pressure building in my ears. I was trapped. My legs felt like they were rooted to the floor, and fear gripped me like a vice. In a last desperate attempt, I ran to the door and yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers were deafening now, like a chorus of angry voices all speaking at once, filling the room with their fury. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, and every hair on my body stood on end.
Just when I thought I would pass out from fear, the door swung open with a violent force, and I stumbled out into the hallway. The whispering stopped instantly, leaving behind an oppressive silence. I didn't look back. I ran down the stairs, out of the building, and straight home without stopping. The next day, I told a teacher what had happened, hoping they would check the room. But when we returned to room 217, the door was locked once more, and the classroom looked undisturbed. No one believed my story. For the rest of the year, I avoided the third floor altogether. But even now, years later, I still hear the whispers in my nightmares. Something was in that room, something that wanted me gone, and I'll never forget the terror that filled my heart in the whispering classroom.
The school's isolation room. It was 3 years ago that I had a memorable experience in my life. I am a musician, and a member of my school's music club. I was often invited to participate in performances at music camps and workshops. That year, I was invited by a school in the suburbs. At the beginning, I felt very happy and excited to be surrounded by friends who shared the same interests and passions as me. As the bus rolled into the town, I noticed the place was quite lively, but that pleasant feeling didn't last long. Within minutes, the bustling noise disappeared. I looked out the window and realized we were entering a dense forest. All I could see were countless trees, and it seemed very quiet. Finally, after a few hours, we arrived. The school appeared before us, and it looked quite mysterious. The students here seemed somewhat unusual. They wore their uniforms neatly and strictly, though the fashion was a bit outdated, like from a decade ago, but their expressions were like they were soulless. They glanced at us with cold eyes whenever we passed by. We had separate rooms, and I went to mine. In my room, there were 3 girls staying together. The room looked rather bare and had little light coming in. Strangely, while we were in the hallway, they kept staring at us in a strange way. That night, after a long day, I returned to my room. I'm not good at sleeping in unfamiliar places, and this place was no exception. I tossed and turned for hours, feeling uneasy and uncomfortable. At around 2:30 a.m., I heard slow, soft footsteps. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear them. Too scared, I pulled the blanket over myself and tried to sleep. The next morning, while we were packing up, I casually asked, "Did anyone else hear footsteps last night?" May, one of my friends, burst out laughing, saying that it was probably just our imagination. But then, Lee suddenly started trembling and asked me,
"You heard it too?"
We all froze. A strange silence filled the room as we realized that we had all heard the same sound. Throughout the day, I struggled to focus, but my mind kept drifting back to those footsteps. By the evening, my fear had grown. I just wanted to go home. That night, the atmosphere in the room felt even heavier. None of us could relax, let alone sleep. Hours passed, but we remained wide awake. Lee eventually fell asleep. May and I stayed up, whispering to each other to distract ourselves. It was just after 2:30 a.m. when the footsteps started again. This time, they were louder, clearer. I broke out in a cold sweat, and goosebumps covered my skin. The footsteps grew closer. Both of us pulled the blankets over our heads, trembling, hoping that whatever it was would leave us alone. Then, I felt it, a light touch on my arm. My breath caught in my throat from the chilling sensation. I trembled, feeling someone standing beside me. I have no idea how long we stayed like that. It was truly a nightmare. The final day at the school seemed to drag on, exhaustion and fear weighing on us. We were drained. As we boarded the bus, the students still stared at us, just like when we first arrived, for no apparent reason. It felt as though they knew something we didn't. On the way home, May fell ill. The bus driver glanced at us through the rearview mirror and said something I will never forget.
I can't believe you actually stayed overnight in that school.
Later, we searched for information about the school and found forums where people were discussing it. It turned out that the room we stayed in was called the isolation room. We also discovered that 2 years before we arrived, 3 students at the school had died there due to the pressures of life, studies, or something else. That's why it was called the isolation room, to keep people away from it. I don't know if anyone else besides the 3 of us has gone through this terrible experience. Did they hear the footsteps, feel the cold breaths on their necks like we did? I'll never know. But what I do know is that those 3 days were the most terrifying of my life. The stalker. I worked as a cashier at a home improvement store, and my coworker, Nicole, quickly became my best friend. She was very sweet, a bit shy, and unfortunately, she was often hit on by customers. Most of the time, it was just harmless flirting or a dinner invitation that she politely declined. But one day, something different happened. Nicole told me about a man who had asked her out. She had declined, as usual, saying that she had a boyfriend. The man seemed irritated but left without causing any trouble. Later that day, he came back. Nicole was helping a customer, so I was alone at the counter when he approached me. He looked quite handsome, but there was something about him that made me feel uncomfortable. He spoke in a deep voice and said he was there to see Nicole. I asked how he knew her, and he lied, saying she had agreed to go out with him and that he was there to pick her up. I knew that wasn't true, so I told him she had already left, hoping he would go away. Instead, his expression darkened, and he crossed his arms, asking why he couldn't see her. Thinking quickly, I blurted out, "She's my fiancée." It was a lie, but it was the only thing I could think of to make him back off. His eyes narrowed, and he looked me up and down with disdain.
"Someone like her with someone like you?"
He scoffed at me. I held my ground, repeating that she wasn't available. He stared at me for a long moment before turning and leaving. I told Nicole what happened when she came back, and she felt creeped out but also found the fiancé excuse quite amusing. We laughed about it, thinking it was over. But 2 weeks later, the man returned, this time after dark. Nicole and I were closing up when we heard a loud bang on the glass door. We both jumped, and there he was, pressing his face against the glass, his eyes wild. "We're closed," I told him, but he didn't move. Nicole shouted at him to go away, but he just stared at us, his breath fogging up the glass. He pointed at me, his eyes full of rage. He yelled,
"I'm not here for her. I'm here for you. If I take out her husband, she'll be mine."
My heart pounded as I realized he intended to kill me. I told Nicole to run to the manager's office and call the police.
911, what's the emergency, please?
As she ran off, the man started ramming the doors, trying to break them down. I was terrified, but I knew I had to keep him outside. I grabbed a 2x4 from behind the counter, ready to defend myself if he got in. The glass doors shook violently, and I was sure they were about to give way. But then Nicole came running back, swinging another piece of wood and yelling that the police were on their way. The man finally stopped, glaring at me one last time before turning and disappearing into the night. The police arrived, but by then, he was long gone. We showed them the security footage, and they promised to keep an eye out for him. A few days later, we heard he had been arrested in a nearby town for stalking another woman. Nicole and I were both shaken by the experience. We quit our jobs shortly after and found safer work. We still talk about that night sometimes, grateful that we had each other's backs. But the memory of his twisted expression and the sound of him trying to break in still haunts me. Horror Story Red Bracelet. I have worked at the hospital for 10 years, something I am very proud of. Most people I meet here have an average working time of just 1 year. The shortest time someone stayed was 1 week. Working here is not easy. They say staff are cursed if they do something wrong. Lights fall on people's heads, they slip on completely dry floors, and fires frequently break out. Patients sometimes become inexplicably violent. No matter how many times they inspect the building or add security staff, the employees always seem to be targeted by bad luck. Even after many years here, I don't know why, but I don't believe in that. I just try to do my best at work. Since working here, nothing unfortunate has ever happened to me. Sometimes I hear strange noises, but they are insignificant. I've gotten used to it and become resilient. One night after a late shift, I stepped into the elevator and immediately pressed the close button to slowly descend to the lobby from the 11th floor, alone. When it reached the 9th floor, the door opened. Reflexively, I reached out to press the close button but stopped when I saw someone standing there. It was a beautiful young girl I had never seen before, probably a new intern. Something about her made me want to talk and ask about her work. I placed my arm in the door to let her in. I asked if she was new. She shyly nodded without saying anything. I was very happy to get to know her. I saw her name tag. Her name was Ilsa. Every night after that, after my shift, at the same time on the 9th floor, Ilsa would be standing there waiting. This surprised me, but I thought it was just a coincidence. She didn't say anything, just bowed her head shy. For the first time in a long while, I decided to open up and make a new friend. One night, while going down in the elevator, as expected, the door opened on the 9th floor where Ilsa was waiting to get in. I decided to ask if she would like to have a drink with me. As soon as she stepped in, she heard a loud noise at the end of the hallway. Both of us looked out. From the corner of the hallway, a dark figure of a man appeared. He was tall, limping, and heading straight for the elevator.
Wait!
The man called out, "And now." She immediately reached out her hand to hold the door. The man sped up and shouted, "Help me! Help!" As the man got closer, my stomach began to churn. Wait, something wasn't right with me. The man was now just a few steps away from the elevator. He waved at us, revealing a red wristband that was bleeding. I immediately pulled Ilsa back and closed the elevator door. He pounded on the door continuously. I recalled the cold, clinical atmosphere of the morgue. The bodies lay on metal slabs, each with a red wristband. The image of a young girl's lifeless hand, limp from the weight of the wristband, flashed through his mind. His heart pounded, a mix of confusion and fear. The elevator swayed, bringing Jazz back to the present. He looked at Ilsa again. She slowly and coldly said,
"Why did you do that? Why didn't you help him?"
I replied,
"I couldn't help him. He was wearing a red wristband, which is only for the deceased in the morgue."
She didn't speak. Then suddenly, she pressed the button to go down to the warehouse basement. Even I rarely go down there alone. I followed Ilsa down a narrow, dark corridor he hadn't noticed before. The walls were adorned with old, faded photos of patients and staff, all wearing red wristbands. The air grew colder. Then her hand fell down, revealing a red wristband. Her back was covered in numerous torn shirt marks. I froze, wondering what this was. Dizzy, dreaming perhaps. I started screaming loudly, and she gave me a horrifying smile. At that moment, all I could do was run for my life, and she kept slowly following me. When I reached the elevator door, I pressed the button frantically, uncontrollably. But the elevator didn't open. My breathing was so rapid I couldn't control it. I just stood there, eyes closed, praying. I held my breath because she was only a few meters behind me, walking slowly. Without waiting any longer, I had to find the emergency exit to run up to the first floor. I ran like I had never run before. Thank God I escaped that dreadful, terrifying place. I might have stayed there too long. It was probably time to leave. The next day, I quit my job. Years later, after I left, I learned that it had been officially abandoned without any explanation. It was a horrifying and unforgettable experience for me. The Freak in the Morgue. The coldest place in the hospital is likely the morgue. Stainless steel drawers holding the dead stretch out like a cold, metallic labyrinth. The air is thick with the scent of antiseptic. I am a forensic pathologist. Today, I'm on shift, preparing my tools for my work. Tonight, I noticed something strange. Foreign objects have appeared during autopsies before, like a rusted coin or a few plastic beads. This isn't the first time something unusual has shown up during an examination. I stepped into the storage room, searching for some necessary items, but a few tools were missing. My eyes were drawn to a drawer slightly ajar. I pulled it open to find an empty space, feeling like something was missing, but I couldn't immediately identify what. A strange feeling washed over me, and I couldn't quite grasp what was happening. I hurried out, moving quickly down the dark hallway. I saw something move in the shadows. A hunched figure, resembling a man, dressed wildly with disheveled hair, was obsessively examining some medical equipment laid out before him. I couldn't believe my eyes. Horrified, I saw a clump of hair, a severed finger, and other small body parts. He held them as if worshiping and collecting them. I felt nauseous and disgusted by him, but I forced myself to stay because I knew I needed to do something. I hadn't finished my work yet. Suddenly, the man stopped and looked around, sensing something. I held my breath, praying I hadn't been seen. I rushed to the office, my hands trembling as I called the police, reporting the break-in and what I had witnessed. The dispatcher on the other end sounded shocked, but assured me that help was on the way. I hung up the phone, but I couldn't get that horrifying image out of my mind. Who was he? And what was he doing? Suddenly, while trying to find a place to hide, he spotted me and chased after me as if he wanted to make me his next victim, the next piece in his collection. I ran as fast as I could, desperately searching for a place to hide. Fortunately, the police arrived just in time, and perhaps he realized that it was no longer just the two of us. He became distracted, giving me a chance to escape. I managed to escape and crouched behind the desk, eyes fixed on the door, counting every second until the police arrived. The police burst in and found the intruder in a frenzy, as if he had lost his mind. He was caught off guard, his crazed eyes wide with panic. The officers quickly subdued him, wrestling him to the ground as he snarled and fought like a cornered animal. They handcuffed the man and began searching the area where he had been, uncovering his gruesome collection, stolen medical tools, body parts, and a disturbing array of personal items taken from the corpses. His twisted obsession and grotesque passion were fully revealed. I stepped out of the room, still trembling, as the police led the intruder away in handcuffs. The man glared at me with pure hatred. The morgue, once a place of routine and order, had become a sight of horror, tainted by human depravity. As the first light of dawn broke, I stepped outside, knowing I had done the right thing and acted quickly. The dead had already suffered enough, and it would have been a tragedy if they were not kept intact. I turned back to the morgue, locking the door one last time. The memory of that night would haunt me, but it was over. I had survived the worst.
Horror story of school locker. Sure, here is the translation of your text into English. A few days ago, Anna attended a party. The police showed up, and everyone scattered. Anna took a shortcut, fell into the river, and has been missing since. When they found her, she was no longer alive. She had passed away. The principal asked Kat to clean out Anna's locker. It had been a week since the funeral, and A&A's. Mother still hadn't come to collect her belongings. Kat nodded, feeling both curious and fearful. Anna had been one of the popular girls, always surrounded by friends. The news of her sudden death had shocked everyone. She wasn't like that. I was quite shy and had almost no friends. She approached the locker, its dull gray door a stark contrast to the vibrant memories of its owner. She twisted the combination lock, and with a metallic click, it opened. Inside, the locker was neatly organized. It only took her a few minutes to scoop Anna's belongings into her backpack. There were just a few textbooks, a small makeup pouch, and a neatly folded scarf remaining. As she reached in to gather the items, a strange gust of wind brushed against the back of her neck, sending a shiver down her spine. She glanced around, but the hallway was empty. She picked up the scarf, its silk smooth and cool. She remembered that Anna always wore this scarf like a treasured possession. It seemed that she really loved it. Suddenly, a whisper echoed in the confined space, telling her that the scarf was beautiful and would suit her perfectly. Her heart pounded. Perhaps she had imagined it. She continued cleaning the locker, but the unease lingered. As she closed the door, the whisper came again, more insistent this time, telling her,
"Wear it always, and everyone will admire you."
How could she refuse? Even as goosebumps rose on her skin, she nodded and tied the scarf around her neck. Although it was silk, it felt heavy, pressing down on her bones. Kat looked up at the mirror and almost screamed. She didn't just look like Anna in that moment. She was Anna. The scarf somehow warped her skin, transforming her face. She pulled with all her strength, but it wouldn't come off. Her elbow struck the mirror, causing it to bleed. Then a voice whispered,
"It's okay,"
and assured her that everyone would love her. She decided to take a chance and see if it was true. Days passed, and she began to notice changes. People who had never acknowledged her before started to smile and greet her. The popular crowd invited her to sit with them at lunch. Kat enjoyed the attention she was receiving. She attributed the change to her makeover and the confidence boost from wearing Anna's scarf, so she didn't believe it too much. But the whispers started again and wouldn't stop. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw Anna's reflection staring back at her, smiling that familiar, haunting smile. It was as if Anna was still there, watching, waiting. Day by day, the whispers grew into screams in her head. Panic set in. She stumbled, knocking over her bedside lamp. As she went to school, she always avoided that locker because she felt a dark presence looming around Anna's locker. Kat's breath caught in her throat as she tried to pull the scarf off, but it tightened, choking her. Then a voice echoed in her head, asking what she was doing. The next day, she decided to return the scarf to Anna's locker, hoping to break the curse. When she approached the locker, the hallway was eerily silent. She unlocked it and placed the scarf inside. Before she could close the door, the scarf flew up and wrapped around her neck again. She fell to the floor, the scarf tightening more and more. Her vision darkened, and the last thing she saw was her own reflection in the locker mirror, her face now twisted into a smile that wasn't hers. A few days later, students whispered about Kat's disappearance. Her locker remained shut, and the smell of decay began to permeate the hallway. The principal and the janitor tried to open it, but the new lock seemed fused shut. Only Kat had the combination. One evening, as the janitor was mopping the empty hallway, he heard a faint whisper.
Wear it, and everyone will admire you.
The janitor glanced around, but saw nothing. He shook his head, thinking it was his imagination. But as he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in a nearby window. He saw Kat's face staring back at him, a silk scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, smiling that haunting, familiar smile. The janitor gradually turned pale and was so frightened that his heart felt like it was going to jump out of his chest. He ran out of there as fast as he could and immediately went to the police station to report what he had just witnessed. At first, he thought it was just an illusion, but when he linked it with Anna's departure and Kat's disappearance, it was really a coincidence, as if there was some kind of curse. Sometime later, the police came and took the cabinet out of the school. The mystery of Kat's disappearance and the scarf remains a mystery that no one wants to talk about.
Horror story, The Strange Man with Red Eyes. This happened 6 years ago when I was working the night shift as a security guard in an old office building. Since then, I have never worked the night shift again. That night, the pale moonlight cast an eerie glow over the deserted scene, creating a chilling atmosphere. Around 3 a.m., I was doing my final patrol before ending my shift. As I walked through the dark hallway, I heard strange footsteps. I looked around, but saw no one. The footsteps continued, seeming to come closer to me. I started feeling uneasy, trying to stay calm and continue my work. But just as I reached the security room, the door suddenly opened. A man with disheveled hair and bloodshot eyes walked in. He was wearing a long black coat and carrying an old suitcase. There was no one around, and I couldn't understand how he got into the building at this hour. I swallowed nervously, trying to speak to him.
Do you need any help?
I asked, my voice trembling. The man didn't answer right away. He just stared at me for a long moment. Then he opened his mouth, his voice raspy like the wind through a crack in the door.
I need to go to a very special place, a place you will never forget.
I didn't understand his meaning, but I responded anyway.
I can't leave the building during my shift. Can you specify the location?
The man smiled in a strange way, his thin lips curling up.
All right, take me to the basement.
I was surprised, but didn't want to cause trouble, so I nodded and led him there. We stepped into the elevator, the air inside becoming oppressive. When the elevator doors opened at the basement level, a cold draft swept in. The man stepped out first, and I followed, feeling more anxious. He stopped in front of a small room, its door long locked. I didn't remember ever seeing this room before. The man pulled out an old key from his coat pocket, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. I stood outside, not daring to follow. "I've reached my destination," he said from inside. "Thank you for guiding me." I turned to leave, but suddenly he appeared right in front of me, as quick as lightning. He placed his hand on my shoulder, gripping so tightly that it hurt. "Remember, you have helped me, and I will remember you." I screamed, trying to break free, but I couldn't. A sharp pain shot through my chest, and I collapsed. My eyes gradually closed. I gradually saw the door of the room closing before my eyes, accompanied by his satisfied, creepy laughter. And then I fainted. When I opened my eyes, I was lying in a hospital bed. The doctor said I had a heart attack, but was lucky to survive. I recalled the man and asked everyone around about him, but no one had seen him, and the security cameras recorded no one but me. From the video extracted from the camera, it seems that I was talking to myself in front of the hallway door and then collapsed on the floor. It seems that I was taken to the hospital by the neighbors. I was haunted by his final look and his mysterious words. I could never forget that raspy voice, and every time I remember, I feel a chill down my spine. I had once guided a mysterious man, and it had changed my life forever. The mysterious camp. I am a camping enthusiast. On this 2-day trip to the forest near my home, I went camping with my longtime companion Ring, the dog that has been with me for a long time. But I realized I was not as alone as I thought. It was in November. The daytime weather was quite warm, but it was quite cold at night. As always, I brought all the camping gear I had. Since it was close to the lake, I also brought a fishing rod to fish. I arrived and set up camp in a comfortable clearing near the lake to fish. While fishing, Ring kept looking into the forest, and his tail was wagging as if he had discovered something. I thought it was probably some small animals that he saw or heard. Ring is very well trained and will not run off without my command. After about an hour of fishing, we walked around the lake. On the other side of the lake, I saw a few people walking into the forest. They were too far away to be sure, but they really looked like humans. We quickly returned to the camp. When I got back to the camp, I saw the tent zipper was open. Someone had entered my tent, but nothing was missing. Not that there was much to take besides the campfire and fishing gear. But I knew I was right. They were a group of people. The thought of them sneaking into my tent without permission made me quite creepy. To be safe, I spent the next hour moving my camp to a different location further down the lake. Then I started chopping wood to light a fire. When the fire was burning, I fed Ring and then warmed up the food for dinner. Ring continued barking into the forest. By then, it was dark, and I couldn't see anything except the firelight. I looked into the darkness with a sense of fear. With that thought, I brought Ring into the tent and extinguished the fire. I crawled into my sleeping bag, and with the reading light beside me, I was reading my novel. Ring's ears kept twitching as he heard things that I couldn't hear. He kept looking around and started growling. I imagined someone out there in the darkness, scarier than a bear. Eventually, Ring calmed down and put his head down. I felt uneasy and wanted the night to pass quickly, so I turned off the light and went to sleep. I woke up a few hours later to the sound of growling and howling. I told Ring to be quiet. I listened and heard someone whistling, the kind of whistle you do to get a dog's attention. Someone was really out there at my camp in the thick darkness, and I was terrified. Then there were footsteps coming closer to the tent until they were right outside and then stopped. Ring howled madly, and I held him tight to keep him quiet without saying anything. There was no crackling fire, just absolute silence except for the wind. Looking towards the tent's zipper, I tried to deepen my voice and commanded and shouted, "You'd better get out of here, don't come any closer," then threatened them with my emergency flare gun. The footsteps moved away from the tent, slow and heavy. I couldn't sleep after that, but I was too scared to leave the tent and pack up in the dark. Then from a distance, the scream of a woman echoed for miles. It sounded like a woman really screaming for her life. That was the last straw. I grabbed my life quickly, put on my shoes, grabbed a flashlight, and ran. I sprinted until I reached my truck. I slept in the truck that night, and at dawn, I went back to the forest with Ring to pack up the camp. I didn't even check to see if my stuff had been rummaged through. I just hurried to get out of there. As soon as I had signal, I called the non-emergency police number I found online to report the scream and the suspicious people around my camp the night before. I don't know what happened after that and don't know what is going on in that forest, but I never went camping there again. Luckily for me, it was a memorable camping trip.
The Curse of the Top Students. The school stood tall and intimidating with its Gothic architecture, old and worn, with ivy creeping up the walls. The atmosphere always felt gloomy. The walls were adorned with old portraits of past headmasters and notable students, their eyes seemingly following anyone who passed by. The floor creaked with every step. Elena, a studious girl in her late teens, was seated at a desk near the back of the classroom, immersed in a book. The room was empty except for her, and the silence was suffocating. The school had a bookshelf dedicated to the history and legends of the school over the years. It was quite large and sparked her curiosity to learn more. Elena searched through the archives, looking for information about a mysterious curse she had heard rumors about. While reading an old history book about the school's founding, she came across a leather-bound book, aged and ancient. Unexpectedly, a page with a paper bookmark revealed a section about the curse of the good and top students at the school. Years ago, the school had been plagued by a series of unexplained events. The top students began disappearing under mysterious circumstances, their academic excellence seemingly attracting a dark force. Shadows moved on their own, and strange whispers filled the hallways. Elena read about how the curse started with a student who made a pact with an unknown entity to achieve academic success. The price was their soul, and the curse had haunted the school ever since. Elena left school to go home. She started to feel scared because she was one of the top students at the school. She hadn't witnessed anything herself, so everything seemed vague to her, caught between reality and fiction. As she descended the stairs, the eyes of the portrait seemed to follow her, glowing faintly and eerily in the light. Elena entered the bathroom to splash water on her face, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. She looked up into the mirror and saw a shadowy figure standing behind her. She spun around, but the bathroom was empty. Her breathing became rapid, and she quickly left. Elena sought refuge in the science lab, hoping to find a logical explanation for the strange events. As she flipped through a textbook, the lights flickered and went out. She heard a low growl and saw beakers and test tubes rattling on their own. A cold breeze brushed past her, sending shivers down her spine. Panic. Elena ran down the hallway, her footsteps echoing loudly. She heard whispers of her name, growing louder and more urgent. She stumbled and fell, the whispers now a cacophony of sinister voices. Beware. Your turn will come. Desperate, Elena burst into the headmaster's office, hoping to find answers. The office was dark and cluttered with old papers and books. The headmaster's chair slowly turned to reveal a shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. Elena screamed and backed away, tripping over a stack of books. Elena fled the building, her heart pounding. She looked back at the school, which now seemed even more menacing under the moonlight. As Alina ran across the school grounds, she felt a presence chasing her. She reached the gates and looked back one last time. There was a dark shadow peering out from the window. Safe back in her room, Elena tried to calm herself, but the events of the night kept replaying in her mind. She opened her laptop and began writing about the curse, determined to warn others. As she typed, she felt a strange sensation. A shadowy figure lunged towards Elena. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure grabbed her arm, and she was suddenly overwhelmed by a flood of terrifying visions. Students being dragged into darkness, their faces twisted in silent screams, and the entity that started the curse grinning maliciously. Elena saw the student who made the pact, standing before a dark figure with glowing eyes, signing a blood-soaked contract. Elena snapped back to reality, the shadowy figure gone. She was left shivering, a dark mark on her arm where the figure had grabbed her. The screen faded to black, and the only sound was a whisper. "Good luck. If you don't leave, you will be next." She didn't know if the curse would follow her, but with such a warning, she decided not to stay another minute. The next day, she left and transferred to a different school. Not long after, the school was abandoned due to rumors, and students gradually left.